The topic we chose is Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears is important because it is one of the biggest events in American history, playing a big role in building America as it is now. This video explains four major aspects of Trail of Tears. Number 1 is introduction, number 2 is the Indian problems, number 3 is Indian removal, and number 4 is the Trail of Tears. At the beginning of the 1830s, nearly 125,000 Native Americans lived on millions of acres of land in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida land their ancestors had occupied and cultivated for generations. By the end of the decade, very few natives remained anywhere in the southeastern United States. Working on behalf of white settlers who wanted to grow cotton on the Indians' land, the federal government forced them to leave their homelands and walk thousands of miles to specially designated Indian territory across the Mississippi River. This difficult and sometimes deadly journey is known as the Trail of Tears.
The Indian problem, white Americans, particularly those who live on the western frontier, often feared and resented the Native Americans they encountered to them. American Indians seemed to be unfamiliar alien people who occupied land that white settlers wanted and believed they deserved. Some officials in the early years of the American Republic, such as President George Washington, believed that the best way to solve this Indian problem was simply to civilize the Native Americans. The goal of the civilization campaign was to make Native Americans as the individual ownership of land and other property, including in some instances in the South African slaves. In the southeastern United States, many Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, and Sioux people embraced these customs and became known as the Five Civilized Tribes. But their land located in the parts of Georgia, Alabama, North Carolina, Florida, and Tennessee was valuable, and it grew to be more coveted as white settlers flooded the region. Many of these white yearned to make their fortunes by growing cotton, and they did not care how civilized their native neighbors were. They wanted that land, and they would do almost anything to get it. They stole livestock, burned and looted houses and towns, and squatted on land that did not belong to them. State governments joined in this effort to drive Native Americans out of the South. Several states passed laws limiting Native American sovereignty and rights and encroaching on their territory. In a few cases, such as Cherokee Nation v. Georgia 1831 and Worcester v. Georgia 1832, the U.S. Supreme Court objected to these practices and affirmed that Native nations were sovereign nations in which the laws of Georgia and other states can have no force. Even so, the maltreatment continued. As President Andrew Jackson noted in 1832, if no one intended to enforce the Supreme Court's rulings, which he certainly did not, then decision would fall stillborn. Southern states were determined to take ownership of Indian lands and would go to great lengths to secure this territory.
Indian removal. Andrew Jackson had long been an advocate of what he called Indian removal. As an army general, He had spent years leading the brutal campaign against the Creeks in Georgia and Alabama and the Seminoles in Florida, a campaign that resulted in the transfer of hundreds of thousands of acres of land from Indian nation to white farmers. As president, he continued these crusades. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the federal government the power to exchange inactive held land in the Kakaton Kingdom east of the Mississippi for the land to the west, in the Indian colonization zone that the United States had acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase. Now it was called as Oklahoma. The law required the government to negotiate removal treaties fairly, voluntarily, and peacefully. It did not permit the president or anyone else to coerce native nations into giving up their land. However, President Jackson and his government frequently ignored the letter of law and forced Native Americans to vacate land they have lived on for generations. In the winter of 1831, under threat of invasion by the U.S. Army, the Choctaw became the first nation to be expelled from its land together. They made journey to Indian Territory on foot and without any food supplies or other help from the government. Thousands of people died along the way. It was, one Choctaw leader told an Alabama newspaper, a trail of tears and death.
The Trail of Tears. The Indian removal process continued. In 1830, the federal government drove the Creeks from their land for the last time. 3,500 of the 1,500 Creeks who set out for Oklahoma did not survive the trip. The Cherokee people were divided. What was the best way to handle the government's determination to get its hand on their territory? Some wanted to stay and fight, others thought that it was more pragmatic to agree to live in exchange for money and other concessions. In 1835, a few self-appointed representatives of the Cherokee Nation negotiated the Treaty of New Echota, which traded all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi for $5 million, relocation assistance, and compensations for lost property. To the federal government, the treaty was done deal, but many of the Cherokee felt betrayed. After all, the negotiators did not represent the tribal government or anyone else. The instrument in question is not the act of our nation, wrote the nation's principal chief, John Ross, in a letter to the U.S. Senate protesting the treaty. We are not parties to its covenants. It has not received the sanction of our people. Nearly 16,000 Cherokees signed the Ross petition, but the Congress approved the treaty anyway. By 1838, only about 2,000 Cherokees had left their Georgia homeland for Indian Territory. President Martin Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott and 7,000 soldiers to expedite the removal process. Scott and his troops forced the Cherokee into stockades at Bayonet Point while whites loot their homes and belongings. Then they marched the Indians more than 1,200 miles to Indian Territory. Whooping cough, typhus, dysentery, cholera, and starvation were the epidemic along the way, and historians estimate that more than 5,000 Cherokee died as a result of the journey. By 1840, tens of thousands of Native Americans had been driven off their land in the southeastern states and forced to move across the Mississippi to Indian Territory. The federal government promised that their new land would remain unmolested forever, but as the line of white settlement pushed westward, Indian country shrank and shrank. And finally, in 1907, Oklahoma became a state and Indian Territory was gone for good.